Copy. Okay, y'all. So let's do this thing. Dope. So there are we've done a lot in these last few sessions. We've gone through a lot of interesting stuff. We finished talking a lot about the main concepts of React, right? Talking about creating elements, creating components, messing around with state and props, all types of stuff. We touched on hooks a couple sessions ago as well, and talked about how you can use React hooks to also get the same benefits that you'd have in a class-based component out of a functional component. Particularly, we talked about the use state hook and the use effect hook, which are two of the hooks that are the most important to use with React. The use state hooks allows you to add state context to your functional components. The use effect hook allows you to update your components based on changes that are happening in terms of like, you know, how the component is data transfers or anything going on in the component. You can use the effect hook in order to create a change out of your component. You can also build your own hooks and all types of stuff there. Today, I want to kind of continue this conversation of like how, just talking more about important topics with regards to React and thinking about this idea of dealing with changes across components, which is a pretty interesting scenario. And, you know, we come across these issues all the time where you have a couple components, some components are using state, some components are not, you're passing props. And if you think about it, at a certain point, that all could get really confusing, right? And I'm sure for some of y'all, it has been pretty confusing thinking about like, when do I use state? When do I use props? How would I connect, you know, different components to each other to share data, especially if they're really far removed and there's not a clear way for them to pass props. So in those moments, there's a very important library that you can use to help help develop a more robust application that can share data across components. The library we're going to talk about is called the Redux Library, and it's a very important library to know when it comes to React. There's other APIs that have been built similar to Redux that you can use outside of it. But I believe that knowing Redux in general is just a helpful library to know. Much like I was explaining to y'all that knowing about the React Router library is also one of those kinds of libraries that you just need to know. So this is another one, like DJ Khaled said, another one that y'all need to know. And so gonna just kind of show y'all an example of how it works. All right, so what I'm going to do is, first off, let's just take a look at the, Redux package. So I'm just gonna go to npm, and I'm just gonna type in Redux, and let's just take a look at this package. So Redux is a particular package in JavaScript that creates a predictable state container for JavaScript apps. So it says it helps you write applications that behave consistently, run in different environments, client, server, native, and are easy to test. It also has a great developer experience and has its own set of debugger tools that you can install on Chrome. Yeah, so Redux is a very important library. As you can see, yeah, it's like over almost 5.5 million downloads just this week alone. Clearly, it's something that a lot of people are using. Its last update was 23 days ago, so it's definitely always being worked on, and a lot of people are relying on that library. So Redux itself is a JavaScript package, so it can work with any JavaScript app, not just React. But there are other frameworks that were built to make it easy to use Redux with React, within React, and I'm pretty sure that's where. There's some libraries that you can connect to your Redux to do very specific things. So we're going to take a look at both the Redux library and package, as well as this React Redux package as well, which is a helper package for connecting Redux to your React application. So both of these, you see both of these packages being used in React project, and its overall goal and concept is to make it so that you can use that predictable state container within your React projects. And so we're going to talk about and see how this would be used, and how we could build our applications to be a lot more predictable with regards to how data moves within them. So cool. So one thing I want to mention since I'm here is there are some templates that you can use with your create React app command to start new applications that are that have specific templates. So for instance, the React Redux library has its own template that allows you to start a new project off, not only with the basic boilerplate that we're used to, but also with the right package information for Redux. It shows us the kind of template project here. So let's just go to this GitHub and kind of see what's how it's kind of built out. So oh, so it just builds the template for Redux. I actually haven't never used it. You've never used the template like this, but we'll just talk about how you can add React and Redux to your React apps in the way that you would expect. Cool. So let's just go ahead and do that. So I'm going to open up a new terminal. Let me do that. And just kind of navigate to my folder. I think I have a project I've been working on in here. Yeah, I called it components. So I'm just gonna open this. I'm gonna just work off of this particular project and just make some changes inside of here to kind of show y'all what we're talking about. So just to make sure, I made some changes last time because I was using it for the routing and using it for the hooks demonstration. So I'm going to just add these changes, commit them. Okay, and now I'm just gonna open it in VS Code so that I can make some changes and just see where the state of the code is right now. Put it back to normal. All right. Okay, so I have some of those example components from when we were using the hooks. I'm just gonna put the app.js back to kind of how it was. Just kind of put some boilerplate in here. I'm gonna say hello world, get rid of this import, save this, and then back in this terminal. So basically I'm just gonna kind of start this project off as if it was a basic project again, and not worry too much about all of this other stuff. I'm gonna also I'm gonna also just add a new folder in here just to clean up my code a little bit. And drag these Jawns in there. All right, cool. All right, bet. So technically, if you look at this app.js, it's back to normal, kind of nothing too much going on. So I'm just gonna work off this, and just kind of let it be, and just show y'all kind of how we would go about adding Redux to an application. But also, in order to do that, you need to kind of show y'all an application use case that would warrant us using Redux in the first place. Let me just build out a simple kind of application that can demonstrate how this all could work, right? And how we might use Redux. While I do that, I'm just gonna go ahead, start this up, and actually, let me do that from inside the. Okay, it already started. Okay, no, it stopped. Great. I like to start the server from the terminal because it's easier to just leave that up, and I can mess around with like Git stuff inside of this VS Code terminal. That's kind of normally my workflow, so that's why I stopped the server. Cool. So this will pop up in a second, and yeah. So we're gonna build a pretty simple application out that can demonstrate to y'all the need for like a tool like Redux. So here we got our little hello world boilerplate. And so I'm going to be building a very simple application that actually have some, we also have some boilerplate code for that I will share with y'all separately from this. But the idea here is I want to show you an example application wherein we would need something to help us manage state in a more effective way. And so to show you kind of this problem that emerges when you are working with applications, let's build out a very simple application that would that can detail out just how like, you know, using state and passing state can get a little confusing when you're working on little bigger applications. So first thing I'm going to do in just to make sure that this app kind of just looks a little nicer than just the text on the side like this, I'm going to go ahead and import again the app.css that came with the create React app. And then inside of this div, I'm just going to give this div the original class name of app so that it kind of syncs back up to the styles that the create React app started with. That way the app is a little bit, just starting off a little bit more stylistically friendly. So cool. So the example here that I want to show you is essentially a simple application wherein we'll have a couple different components that are each responsible for showing a little bit of data. So let me just build this out real quick as an example. Hopefully you'll see that it's not going to be too complicated of an app. But instead of returning this text here, I'm going to return, I want to return a couple components. And I haven't defined those components yet, so I will define them soon. So I'm going to have a person component. I want a feelings component. And I want a hair color component. So clearly, because I want these components to be rendered, I'm going to have to, one, create them and then also import them. So I'm just going to get ahead of myself and just kind of build them here, kind of how I intend to save them. So I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate this a couple times. So now I got those three things imported, but I still got to make them. Note, I made components and then I made this other folder called Redux Demo. So I'm just going to make a new folder in my components called Redux Demo. And inside of there, I'm going to make a new file called person.js, another file called feelings.js, and one more file called haircolor.js. Dope. And each of those components are going to be fairly simple. So the person component itself is just gonna get some information about, just say some information about like who the person, who we're currently looking at, like who is this user. So what I'm going to do is just create a couple functional components to start with. So let's say function person return a little div. Inside of that div, I'm just gonna say, matter of fact, yeah, inside of that div, just for right now, I'm just gonna say person so we can see something on the screen. And I'm going to export that component. So cool, that's kind of good. Feelings one, similarly, I'm just gonna copy this over. Dope. Same thing for the hair color. Dope. So now I can go back to the app.js and I can save this, and hopefully I'm gonna see some stuff, because all of these things are returning just some text, right? In the div, it's gonna all kind of get jumbled up, bundled onto the same line, or similarly like this, kind of just stacked. So just to give stuff a little bit more space, I'm gonna actually add another element, just a break element in here. The break element just creates a new line between things that would normally be in the same place. So just give myself a little bit of space. Cool. So each of these three components are now going to be kind of responsible for their own little bit of things. The person component is going to really kind of learn about who it is that we're talking to. So it's going to get some information from the user in a form. The feelings component is going to ask the user how they're doing, and to tell us how they're doing and how they're feeling. And then the hair color is just going to ask the user to show us, just select their hair color. So each of these are going to kind of have interactions with the user to ask them, yeah, just tell us a little bit more about yourself, and just select some information about like who you are, basically. So to build this out a little bit more, essentially, the person component, just gonna build this out a little bit more specifically. So first, let me just open these parens. Change this to a form, because I'm gonna ask for some input in the form of an input. So I'm gonna build a form real quick. Inside of the form, I'm gonna have a header, and I'm gonna say a heading, and I'm gonna say my name is, and I'm just gonna say my name is Cam to start, and inside of here, just save it like this to start out. And then the feelings component, this is where I'm gonna ask the user to just share a little bit more about how they're feeling. And essentially, I'm just gonna ask the user like, yo, like, you know, select like kind of your mood, like how are you feeling right now, right? And so in this, I'm just gonna also kind of add a little heading, and I'm just say, how are you feeling right now? And then inside of here, just gonna add a couple buttons. Say happy, copy this over, sad, mad, Cool. And then in the hair color is kind of similar to this this question and set of buttons. So what I'm gonna do is just copy this over. It's like, what is your hair color? And then just, you know, something like, brown, blonde, black, whoops. Yeah. Cool. So cool. So going back to the app, kind of got a nice little vibe here. My name is blank. How am I feeling right now? I can see some buttons here, some options for me to choose. What is my hair color? Also some options to choose. So now the idea here is that I want to be able to actually, you know, make some choices and change some things. So this is looking like a good opportunity for me to potentially connect some of these components to state, right? So within this, my name is section, what if I actually want, instead of it just being hard coded like this, what if I actually want the user to be able to choose the name that they want, right? And I want it to be something where now this user can come to the app and say, hey, you know, my name is blah, 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 and put their name into the, just change their name, right? So how would I do that? Well, maybe I'll just create a little input, and I can create an input inside of this form, right? That might just ask for some text and say, hey, you know, this input, just like we saw with the link, fave links kind of app, is going to just receive some text from the user. I'm gonna just console log right now. Just so that this can get shown up the right way. So I'm gonna add a form input, right? And the input is simple, right? The input is here. I'd want to be able to type something here, and then hopefully this changes maybe this name, and gives some context to how this thing can change, right? So far, so good. We've been building a lot of apps that have used buttons and changed things conditionally. We've used inputs to change things. The question now is, of course, like, you know, how will we wire this up in a regular sense? Well, we would want this input to be connected to state, because we want to track that change over time, right? So we have a couple options here, given how we've talked about these last couple times. We could either use the useState hook and just keep this as a functional component. But for the sake of just kind of just making sure that we just are aware of just the fundamentals, I'm gonna just go ahead and say, okay, I'm clearly gonna want some state in this component. So rather than make this a function, I'm just gonna quickly turn it into a class. And in order to do that, I gotta import React from the top.
Professor, can you repeat that? Because you're using states, you're gonna make it a class?
Yeah, so I have two options when I want to use state, right? Option one is I can create a class and then use create state within the class. Or option two is to use the use state hook, which we kind of talked about a couple of sessions ago. But the use state hook is kind of newer, so I don't want to confuse us. So I'm going to just do what we've been doing for a longer period of time and just talk about state from the context of a class. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, cool. So just like before, I'm just going to create a really simple constructor function. And inside of this constructor function, called super, because this is a class. And I'm just going to create a new state, right? Simple like this. Create a new state. And maybe I say name and set it to an empty string. And then if I really want to connect this input so that the text from the input is able to be changed, I can add a new function, right? So maybe like a function called like change name or something, right? And this function is going to be a function that I'm going to make it an arrow function just because this function is going to be a function that instead of my onChange just doing something random, I'm just going to have my onChange call this function change name. This dot. Just a little bigger. So yeah, so I'm connecting this input to a onChange function. So every time the input gets changed, it'll call this dot change name. Change name is up here because it's an event function responding to the click, not clicks, excuse me, responding to the inputs being changed. Is going to receive the event object, right? And from that, I can take the data from the event object to update the state, right? And so that would look maybe something like this, where I have a this.setState function, and inside of that function, I'm just going to say change that name state that I created up here, change that state to have the event.target.value, right? So we're getting the data back from the event that needs to be changed. Down here, I forgot my curly braces. That's why this thing is a little mad at me. Cool. And yeah, so now now I have a state that is tied to this name, right? So if I save this now, hopefully this all is kind of working. Oh, last thing I need to do is on this input, just make sure that I connect the value of the input to the state, this dot state dot name, right? So it's going to start out empty. As the change name function changes it, the name is going to get updated with whatever the value is. And now the value of this input is already kind of stored so that it can update alongside the onChange function as well. So when I save this, hopefully I can type in here. But we don't really see anything changing. So what if now I connect this component's title, right? This little heading to that state as well. So maybe I do something like this, and I say this.state.name. Right? So hopefully this all makes sense. I have a state with name, created an input in this form to change the name, connected that to a function that will take the event and get the data back from it and set the state to be a new name, right? That's no longer empty as you're typing. So now that this is tied to the state, you can see it went to empty. So now I'm going to say cam, and there you go, right? So this component is kind of wired up, doing something interesting with regards to taking in my name. Right? So I'll just leave it as cam right now. So cool. Hopefully this makes sense. And just to make sure that we're kind of on the same page, show a thumbs if this makes sense to you. And like kind of you're like, this all kind of is similar to stuff we've seen before. Hopefully the answer is yes, because this is fundamental React stuff that we've seen before. It might feel a little off because I'm going a little quick. I'm doing that because of time, but hopefully this makes sense. And all we're doing here is just using state inside of this class-based component to get the data from the input in the form to change up this other element inside of this component. Right. And so whenever we have data that's changing inside of a component, we use state, right? And that is how components get updated. So now let's talk about these other two components, the feelings component and the hair color component. So feelings component is interesting, is asking how you feeling right now. And it has a couple of options. And I want those options to then change something in this component as well, right? I want this component to also maybe update based on if you click happy, something happens, or sad, something happens, mad, something happens to this component. So I'm just gonna make some small tweaks to this component to kind of show an example of what would happen if I were to also make this component um, do some interesting stuff related to this as well. So again, I have these buttons, happy, sad, and mad. I can very easily connect this to doing something interesting with maybe like happy will change. Maybe this heading gets changed as well. So I'm gonna say I'm gonna add a couple, another little element inside of here to just kind of add like maybe a little emoji or a face or something that will show up when the user kind of chooses something. So right now, like imagine like when the user chooses a particular emotion. I don't know why this drawing ain't popping up. When the user chooses a particular emotion, I want to just choose one of these different emojis to show up like when that user's feeling that. So I got happy, sad, and mad. So I'm just gonna grab those emojis right now because it was not working from VS Code. Happy, let's see, and mad. Got you. So what I'm gonna do is just like, so imagine like if you click happy, you see this emoji, right? If you click sad, maybe you see this one. And if you say mad, you see this one, right? So different emojis kind of tied to different, those different emotions. So again, because I want to change this component and have it show something conditionally, right, internal to it, data has to change inside of it. So what do I got to do? I have to connect it to state, right? This component's data is changing. It needs to know to change and update itself. And so because of that, I'm going to also want to connect this component to state. So I'm going to quickly turn this component also into a state, a class-based component. I was going to say a stateful component, same thing. Class feelings extends react.component. And all I got to do is add a render in front of this. And voila, class-based component. Dope. So now that I have this class, I'm going to just add another constructor here. And this constructor is going to have also just initiate the super and then create a state. And let's say that this state is going to have a data point called mood. And the mood is going to be one of these things, happy, sad, or mad. And okay, cool. So each of these buttons has to kind of has to let me know like, okay, hey, you know, change this thing up or whatnot, right? So what I'm going to do is just, you know, for the sake of making this clear, I'm just going to have a couple of functions that I can tie to each mood, and each button will hit that specific function. So for instance, like when the happy function gets called, it's just going to set the state to be, it's going to set the state to say that the mood is the happy face. Right? And all of these other functions are going to be somewhat similar, so I'm just going to copy them. Right? So we got the sad, and we got angry. And so, actually, mad. Let me just keep it consistent. Change this to mad. Whoops. So if you're interested in this, you can also use emojis as text. So that's how I'm doing this. Is you can set emojis as strings, and your browser will know that you're using emojis. So cool. So now, as you can see, I'm setting this mood to be something specific, right? So now I can also connect this to state, this.state.mood, right? And this mood will be basically coming back from the state. It'll start off empty and then change up based on whatever these folks put in. So now the last step is I just got to connect these buttons. So I'm just going to say on click, and then say to call those specific functions, right? So when you're happy, it's going to call the happy function. When you're sad, it's going to call the sad. When you're upset, it's going to call the mad, right? Cool. So another little stateful component. So how are you feeling right now? Happy, sad, mad. Happy, sad, mad. Right? This component still works. This component still works. And then the last one is kind of similar with the hair color. It's just gonna change some stuff based on the hair color. So hopefully you see that, you know, this one is pretty similar to this other one, this feelings one. So I'm just gonna copy this one over actually and just change this up. So, you know, what is your hair color? And change these to be like, you know, actual hair colors, black, blonde, and I'm just going to change these functions to kind of be similar, but just named appropriately. So up here, red, black, brown, blonde, and but instead of these kind of returning this simple string, I'm just going to have it return a color. So each of these will return a specific color. So when it's red, it's just going to return red. Black will return black. Brown will return, I have like a specific RGB for brown. So I'm going to just put those RGB values in there instead of just putting a string. So remember that these colors are tied to like what you would see in CSS. So we're going to actually tweak the style to make this work out with some CSS. So you can also pass RGB values or a hex code if you wanted to do that also. Same for blonde. I'm going to use an RGB value that I have over here, 212, 196, 106. All those functions are already wired up. I'm going to change this a little bit. Instead of saying the hair color, like I would say my hair color is, and then let me just give myself some space. And what I'm going to do is actually change this element up a little bit to include a span. And that span is going to have some style. I'm going to do a little conditional styling here. So I'm going to say the background color is going to be this.state.color. And then the color is also going to be this.state.color. And then this spans are an interesting element. They take the size of whatever is defined inside of it. So kind of like a div, but the spans are not our inline element versus a block element. So this is just a little HTML kind of element that is helpful for creating a little container, but instead of it being like a big block container like a div, it kind of is going to be a container that is about this long in size. So when I save this, right, so now it starts off with these 3 dots because that was the text in between the span, right? But now hopefully clicking these Jawns should change that span up, but right now it is not. Let's see why. Oh, because I gotta change these state. So the state here is color. So I want to change everything that says mood to be color. Dope. Cool. So now I can see this changing a little bit more intentionally, right? And so all these components now have some data that they're responsible for. They're all using state in a unique way. And now here's the question. If I wanted to have data from one component go to the other component, right? So instead of this saying my name is Cam, maybe I want this to pass the data from this component that has the name into this component. and maybe into this component. So it says Cam's feeling this, or Cam's hair color is blah, right? What would I have to use in order to do that? We've been talking about state for all of these internal parts of the component. This is an example of when you would need to use props, right? Because the only way, I repeat, the only way for you to pass data between components is to use props. So just remember this. State is for data that changes inside of the component. All of this stuff is changing inside of this component, right? All these things are changing, but none of these components have a clue about any of the data that's changing here. Now that I want to pass some data or something over, I got to pass it via props. So let's figure that out now. Where would I got to be in order to pass the props, right? So if I want, for instance,
Parent.
right, exactly. If I wanted to send this data from this component to this component, right, I would need to make sure inside of the parent component, I can take this data and then pass it to this element as it's being created, right? And so the only parent that I have right now is this app.js, right? So what would I have to do in order to make this work? Well, I could either, there's a couple things that I could do, and we've historically have tried our hand at doing those things, right? We could maybe create, maybe turn the app into like a state container, right? And like give the app some state. And then the app now, like, you know, like if we made the app a state component, you know, let's say, like if I were to make the app a state component, well, one, either I'd have to turn this into a whole class-based component right now, or I could use that use state hook. But now the app is gonna have to have data from the person, the feelings, and the hair color, and then pass it around, and you know, pass it as a prop, or like it kind of feels a little confusing, right? Like, like why would the app need to know all this stuff and like I guess house all of this stuff so that it can pass it down? It kind of is a format that makes sense in theory when you're working with smaller components. But imagine if these components are like 3 levels deep, and inside of the person component, there's another component, there's another component. Like, would I want all of those components to know about state and then pass it to props each time? Like, no, that kind of feels a little bit confusing. So in these moments where you're like, okay, I want to pass data from one component to another, and I want to do it in a smart and a predictable way, that is the exact moment where you can ask yourself, maybe I need Redux. Maybe I could use Redux or the Redux API to make this easier for me. Why? Because Redux is a predictable state container. What does that mean? It means that it can house a state. It can house the state of your application as a whole, all of the components. And then each component can essentially get whatever value from state it needs to change itself up by way of getting the right reference to the state. So Redux has its own website. So it's redux.js.org. So on the Redux website, you'll learn more and more about how the Redux package works. But the idea behind Redux is you can use Redux as a container that sits on top of your application and keeps a record of all of the state changes that are going on inside of your app. That's essentially what Redux does. It is a state container. So it is a container for your app that allows you to keep record of different changes going on across the board in your app, so that you can predict changes and you can change the state very simply across different components and pass the data around as props to your components. So the Redux library has like a really good getting started and examples section. So I definitely recommend that y'all take a look at the Redux library. There's a couple of different things you need to know in order to use Redux. There's 3 big things that you need to know. There's what's called a store, there's what's called a reducer, and then there's what's called actions. So we're going to talk real quick about those 3 things: the store, that reducer, and the actions. And these are basically three objects that work together to make this predictable state container work with React. So I'm going to show you real quick. I'm not going to follow the guide here, but I'm going to show you real quick how you set up Redux in your application and just connect it so that you can see how this would be useful. So first thing I want to do is I need to install the right packages that I need. So we talked about NPM and how you can install packages. When you need a specific library, you can use NPM to install those libraries inside of your code. So I'm going to NPM install Redux. And I can also, so one thing that you can do with NPM is you can list multiple packages in your NPM install. You could say you want to install this. I could also say I want to install this, right? So anything separated with a space is going to assume is a new package. So I'm going to install these two packages, the Redux and the React Redux libraries. Those are the two packages that I need in order to work with Redux in this, in order to work with Redux in general, right? I need those Jawns. So, so I'm just gonna go ahead and let this npm install work. It's gonna install the Redux package, and then it's gonna install the React Redux package. So remember, Redux is the main package. React Redux is a specific kind of helper package that allows us to very much more easily add Redux into our applications that are using React. And let's see. Cool. So while this is installing, let's see, did it work? Okay, yeah, I think it worked. Let's check the package JSON, just make sure. Okay, bet. So I got the React Redux in here and the Redux in here as well. Cool. So, like I mentioned, there's three important concepts. There's three important like concepts you got to understand with Redux. So those particular Jawns are the Redux Store, the reducers, and actions. So let's first talk about the Redux Store and how we use that when it comes to creating a state container for our application. So basically what Redux does is it sits on top of our entire application and acts like a global variable that all of our components have access to and can change. This is very similar to how the browser router, remember when we talked about React, we talked about the React router package and how we create this like container that sits on top of our application called the browser router. And that container was responsible for handling, letting our components know that it can do navigation. Well, this is very similar with how Redux works. In fact, it is the exact same kind of setup where we have to create our container that sits on top of our application very similarly. So I'm gonna get rid of the browser router for now because we're not actually doing React router stuff. If I was, I could keep it here, but since I'm not, I'm just gonna get rid of it for now. And we're gonna specifically talk about Redux. So there's two things you have to do in order to have Redux work as a container for your application. And you need both of those libraries that we just installed. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import create store from Redux, right? So this is a particular function that comes in Redux. If we look through the API guide, right, creating the store is one of the first things you got to do. So here it's talking about how you got to create the store, you import create a store. And it says, hey, you can change the index.js to create your store. So this is exactly what we're actually going to do. We're going to use the create store function that comes from Redux. It's going to create a new store for us. We'll talk about what a store is in a second. And then pass it this thing called a reducer. And then we're going to wrap our application with this other component called a provider. And that's going to be how we set up Redux within our components. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to import the create store from Redux. I'm going to import the provider from React Redux. So this is where we're going to use that React Redux library that has some helpful components for us to use to work with Redux. And yeah, we're gonna leave this like this for a second. So first thing I need to do in order to work with Redux is I need to create an instance of a Redux store, right? The store is the global state container for the app. So this is when we talk about this global container, state container, whatever, it is what is called a store. That's what the store is. It's just a global container for the app. So in order to create a store, right, I got to use this create store function from Redux. So I'm just going to say let store get a create store function. And inside of this function, I'm going to have to pass something very important in a second. But then after I have this store that's created from that function, right, I can use this provider that I get back from React Redux. So remember, this is on this is inside of this getting started with Redux section in the Redux documentation, and it's talking about configuring the store, right? So I need to create this thing called a provider, and the provider is a component that's going to actually wrap my app, just like the browser router kind of wrapped the app in the other React router library. The provider is the component that wraps the app when you're working with Redux. The provider needs a prop called a store, right? So it is looking for the store you just created to be passed into it with that particular prop. So this is all you need to do in order to kind of wrap your component, wrap your application with this global state container. But in order to create the store, there's one more thing we have to do. We have to actually create what's called a reducer. So remember, there's three things we got to learn about with Redux. There's the store, which we just talked about, is the global state container. And now we're going to talk about what a reducer is in a second. So for now, I'm going to pretend like I already built one. And I'm going to say Redux demo / reducers. So I'm going to pretend like I already have one created, and I'm just going to bring it in here. So now I got to actually make one called root reducer. So inside of that, inside of the source folder, typically what we do with Redux-based applications is we create another folder for the reducers and the actions. So inside of this folder, I'm gonna just create a new folder and call it Redux. I'm gonna call it Redux, and then inside of the Redux, I'm gonna create a new folder inside of the Redux folder here called reducers. And this folder is where I'm gonna create this new file, and that file is gonna be called index.js, which is gonna be basically my kind of default file that's gonna get returned. Yeah. And so yeah. So now I gotta want to talk to y'all about what is a reducer and like how it really works, right? And so essentially, a reducer is just a function that will change the global state, right? It's that simple. We have the store, which is the global state. A reducer is just a function that will change the global state. It'll basically tell the global state, here's what you got to do to change yourself up. I'm going to show you an example of a reducer. You can see an example of a reducer probably here in the Redux the Redux introduction here. So yeah, here's some examples of a reducer and all of those things. But yeah, so I'm just gonna make it a simple one so that we can see how this would work. So a reducer's job is really to just take whatever it needs to take, and in as input is going to take some changes as input, and it's going to return what the state should be after those actions have taken place. So for me, I'm going to create a simple reducer. I'm going to call it name reducer, because basically what I want to have happen with this application is that the name change happens, and when the name change happens, that action of changing the name is going to save this data into the global state. And then all of these components should be able to get that data back from the global state, versus me having to make this really complicated app.js structure that really makes the components know more than they really need to know at any given moment in time. Quick note for y'all that I'm gonna drop in the chat real quick. Dope. So keep that in the chat for y'all. No problem if you got a slide, it's all good. But I'm just gonna finish this up real quick and show you how you can set up the Redux. Give me like 10 minutes, I'll probably be done. So essentially what this reducer does is it creates a function that is going to return something very simple. All it needs to return is what the state should be for the application, right? So, you know, state is an object, a JavaScript object. That object typically is represented. It typically is represented as an object, like key value pairs, but you can also return it as an array or whatever you want it to return. But for the sake of clarity, we always think about our state as an object. So I'm gonna mess around with a state that is structured like an object. So in this case, right, the reducer takes in two parameters. It takes in, it can take in and receive a state, like kind of like the default state you could think of. So I'm gonna say the default state is gonna be set to name is Cam, and then it also can take in what's called an action. And we're gonna talk about action in a second. What the reducer does though is it takes these two things, it takes the state as it is, and it takes the action that it received, and it allows you to make a function that basically says, based on this action, what should the state be? So I got to return, at some point, I got to return the state. You know what I'm saying? That's like the ultimate job of this function. But what makes a reducer is it's a function that reduces the state to whatever it needs to be changed into. In order to do that, you can really granularly say, based on this particular action, I want the state to do this. Based on that, I want the state to do that. So typically what you'll see is people create a switch statement for their action. And based on the action that the reducer received, it's going to trigger different types of state changes to be made, right? So one type of state change that might be made, right, based on this application is, well, the name is being changed, right? So I might have a case here for the name change. And when the name change is being, when the name is being changed, I want the reducer to say, hey, the state that should be returned is going to have everything that the old state had, but the difference is that the name is going to be different, right? We're going to take the name from the action, and I'm going to talk about an action in a second, right? We're going to want the name change to say, hey, there's a new name inside of this, in the state, just like how we have it currently inside of person, right? Right now, whenever the name change is being called, right, we're setting the state to be this new state. It's the same thing that we're trying to do here, but we're doing it on the global state. So we're saying, hey, I want the global state to have whatever, you know, was already inside of it. This syntax right here is the destructuring syntax. It says, take this object called state, and if there was any other parameters on it, add those parameters to this new object I'm returning here, but change the name to action. It would also be the same as just saying, I could also do it kind of like this and say name action. But by putting the ... state in there means that if I had any other properties, like example here, like these properties would stay consistent. The only thing that would change would be the name. So that's what the destructuring syntax allows you to do. Right now, I only have one state value in here. It's the name. So I could technically go ahead and just say that the state is going to be a new state with the name as action. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that just to make it make a lot more sense for y'all and not feel too complicated. But a switch, right? A switch statement is like a conditional handling statement in programming languages, right? It helps you do like if-else conditions based on specific cases. So we're going to also talk about this case here in a second as well when we talk about the action. But to finish this switch statement up, right? A switch statement will return different cases based on some parameter it's looking at. But if it can't find one, it has a default statement, right? And that default statement says, hey, if you don't find a case that matches, just do whatever the default statement says. So in this case, the default will just say return the state as it regularly is. So the state as it is right now would be starting out with the name as Cam, but maybe over time that changes. And then if it's not receiving this particular action change, it won't ever change the state to something else. It'll just be the same state over and over again. So now let's talk about this whole action thing and like this whole like case situation and what actually are we going to switch on with this reducer? Well, the thing is, actions are a very specific object in Redux. Actions are basically functions that are, let's see what it says. Actions are basically functions. No, this is the fact. I don't want to see this. I want to see the API documentation. Okay, yeah. Actions are very specific functions that get called when things are changing in the state. Actions basically are like, if you have like a specific action, an action is not just as it sounds like, right? There's actions happening in the web on the application, and those actions are triggering changes in the state. So remember, we had three things we had to know. The store. The store is the global state. The reducer is just a function that will say, hey, what should the new state be based on some actions? And actions are basically just functions that get called at different moments in our app. You can think of them like event handler functions kind of. And those functions trigger the reducer to change. So the action says, hey, reducer, I want you to change. The reducer says, okay, what action am I looking at? Is it this particular action? If so, I'm going to do this to the state. And then you define what each action does to the state. And that's what makes Redux so predictable, is you specifically specify actions based on what you want those actions to do with regards to the changing the reducer. So only other thing I need to do in order to get this to work, to show y'all this whole full Redux situation, is typically in a Redux-based app, we have a reducers folder and we also have an actions folder. So I'm going to create this actions folder in this Redux folder, and I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call that index.js as well. The index.js system here is just every folder in JavaScript will look initially for an index.js file to return. So if you define an index.js file inside of a folder, this is the file that it will default to returning for it when you import it. So like I mentioned, actions are functions that update, that attempt to update, I should say, the global state. And I should say actions trigger reducers to actually update the state, right? So all an action is just a function. So I'm just going to create a new function. I'm actually going to call this function name change, right? And this function is going to basically say, hey, once this function gets called, it's going to do something very specific. It's just going to return what it's going to return. It's going to return an object that's going to get passed into our reducer. So so Redux works like this. It knows that the actions that are getting called are going to always trigger a reducer. Every time an action gets called, all of the reducers that you define in your Redux are going to get called too. And they're going to look at the action that was called, and they're going to say, hey, do I have a condition for this particular action? If I do, return that particular state. If I don't, hey, just return the state as it is, because I actually don't have a reducer for that action. That's how Redux works. So every action triggers the reducers to change. So an action is a function that returns a very simple object that has two parameters. It has two types of parameters. One is a required parameter. It has to return a type. The other parameter is optional, but it can return data. So all actions return a type. They can optionally return a payload of data. So all actions have to return some type, and we'll see what that type is in a second, but they also can return a payload, which is some data that it can get passed in. So for instance, maybe this function gets passed in some text based on like, how this app is working. Maybe this text is changing, and that text triggers the action creator to get called. And that action calls this function. It takes the text that was passed into the function, just like a regular function, you can pass arguments, right? And it says, hey, the data that this action is returning is this text that's coming back from it, right? Now, the type parameter is very important. Every action has to have some specific type that comes with it. And you can think of that like kind of like an ID or a value that kind of goes along with every action. So in this case, I'm going to give it a type of name change. So when this action gets triggered, right, it's going to come in, it's going to trigger this reducer, right? And every reducer is going to get called with these actions and state, right? The action is going to come into this switch statement. And based on the action type, right, we're going to actually be able to switch on this statement. We're going to say, hey, this is actually the name change action that's gotten called here. And this name change action actually has some data. So we can actually return this data inside of our state. So we can return, just like we were seeing action.type here, we can say action.payload and set the data to be consistent here, where now the name change parameter, the name change type, which corresponds to this action, is passing this data along to the reducer. The reducer is going to take that data, change the state based on this conditional case, and then the state, the global state, which is the store here, is going to actually get changed. And that's how Redux works. Every time you make a new action, those actions trigger all of the reducers to get called. You can very specifically tell each reducer what it should return based on certain cases of those actions. And that's how your state gets updated very easily. So now I have a reducer defined inside of here. I have action defined here as well. And yeah, the only thing left is for me to connect the dots and show you the last step of how you can actually use Redux to in essence return the value from these various from these reducers into your application. So right now, just to test, just to show y'all kind of how this works, there's two more things I got to show you, which is how you connect your components to Redux and how you can get both send data to the Redux store state, and then how you can pull data from the Redux state. So let's see these last two things, and then we're going to be done for this little session. So right now I have this person component, right, where the data actually is changing. As the state is changing on the form, it's calling this change name function as just changing the state locally. This is local state changes, right? Anytime we're doing set state or use the state hook, all of that is local. But now we have Redux in our application. So we actually can connect this component to Redux and allow that component to update the global state. So let me just make this clear. Here we're changing the local state, right? And I don't really want to do this anymore. What I want to do is I want to actually change the global state. So let me show you how you can do that with regard to Redux. So there's a specific Redux helper function that you need to add in order to connect your component to Redux, and it's called the connect helper. That function, the connect helper function, allows us to connect to the Redux state, the global state, right? So I'm going to import the connect from React Redux, right? So React Redux, again, this is that React specific library that helps us connect to Redux. So the connect library is a specific tool, object out of a function out of the React Redux package. So now that we imported this, we can connect our component to Redux. And the simplest way to do that, the easiest way to do this, is you just scroll to the bottom of your component where you're exporting, right? And where you say export default, you just add connect right before whatever it is the component is called. And you can wrap that in parentheses, just like this. The connect helper also takes in passes some optional functions that you can define. There's two functions, and these are the two things we're going to talk about, and then we're going to wrap. One function is called map state to props. Map state to props is a function that you have to define in order for your component to take the data from the Redux store, the global state, and essentially take the data from the global state and allow for you to use that data inside of your component. There's another function that this connect helper function can define called map dispatch to props. And this is a function that allows you to connect your component to the Redux helper that will allow you to actually dispatch the action. So remember, we have some actions that are defined here, and those actions are supposed to dispatch changes to the reducers, right? The reducers then get changed, and those reducers then update the global state. But in order to do that, we actually have to call those, we have to actually call those specific functions, right? And so I'm just gonna show you how this all works, and then show you how you can use these two functions more specifically to make the code a little bit cleaner. So the connect library takes the connect library allows you to basically define these particular props that you want to pass into your components. If we go back to the Redux store, I'll just show you to connect. Let's go to React Redux so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the Redux website, but there's also a website for React Redux, which will be a little bit more helpful for you to see kind of just all of the Redux stuff kind of put together. Inside of here, you'll see it talk about the Connect API right here. So yeah, if you go through the tutorial, you can do everything that I'm talking about here. You can start doing with hooks. They have some new hooks that you can use with Redux. But I'm just using the class because that's the typical method that people have been using, and what makes it a little bit easier. So here you see those two functions, map state to props and map dispatch to props, like I'm talking about. And here's how you connect the component to those things, kind of just like I was showing you. Okay, so let me see. do, 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 do. Okay. So inside of the Redux store, just to finish this up real quick, in order for this whole app to kind of get a sense of using the global state, right? I need to actually use a function that is going to call the global state to update itself. So what I normally do, and what you normally do when you're using Redux, is you use the connect helper so that you can connect to the Redux global state. And then you want to make sure that the global state is able to basically receive the changes that you want to call. So there's a couple of ways to do this. And one way, you don't actually need the connect helper. So I'm gonna actually show you the connect helper in a second. Basically what we need to do is we need to tell this component, the input component, right? After it's changed on change, we want this component actually to call a specific function that is going to update the global state. So this dot change name, what we want this dot change name to do now is actually update the global state. So I'm going to write a new change name function. And I'm going to say this dot change name now is going to take the, it's still going to take the event. It's still going to get the event logic from here, from before, right? And we're going to, instead of setting the local state to event.target.value, we're going to set the global state. So in order to do that, I need to make use of that action that I defined inside of my actions folder called name change. I have a function called name change as an action. So inside of here, I got to import that function so that I can make use of it, right? So first I'm going to, let me just put a comment here. We need to import the action we created so we can call it from our local component, right? So here I'm gonna grab that function that we created. It's called name change, and the name change is a specific module, right? It's an exported module inside of this folder, inside of this file called actions. So I'm gonna import it here. Import name change from, let's see, what is the so it's / outside of the Redux demo, outside of the components, / Redux / actions. So I got to get it out of that specific file where it was saved, right? And so now I have this name change function that is here, but I have to call it, right? So inside of change name now, what I'm gonna do is, this is gonna look a little funky, but just bear with me. I'm gonna call this.props.dispatch. And we're gonna talk about that in 1 second, what that's doing. This.props.dispatch basically is allowing, because we connected our entire application to the global state already, right? When we put that, when we put the provider around the application. So now all the components have access to a specific, function called dispatch. And this.props.dispatch allows us to trigger the action, right? So here, basically now I can say that function that I want to call is name change. And I want to call this function, remember name change is this function, right? It takes in some text and then returns this as an action for the reducers. So the text that this is going to pass in is event.target.value, right? All of the data that's coming back from the form. And now this change name function should realistically trigger our Redux state to get updated. Our global state should get updated, and we should see some changes happening in the state. An easy way to make sure that this is the case is right above the switch. You can make a console.log, and you can console.log the state or something, right? But also there's a Redux helper. There's a Redux helper dev tool that you can install if you use Chrome or Brave as a browser. So now go back to this. So first I gotta hook this back up. So inside of the so I call this name reducer. So inside of the index.js file, I actually want to call this name reducer. Okay, one sec. Okay. Okay, let me just make 2 changes to make this this Jawns work for us real quick. So inside of this reducers folder, I'm gonna actually, I didn't do it before, but I'm gonna separate this into its own file. So I'm gonna make a file for the name reducer. I'm just gonna make a file inside of the reducers. I'm gonna call it name reducer.js. And this is typically a structure that you would see with reducers. I just thought it would work without it, so I didn't do it at first. So I'm just gonna copy all the stuff that we have for the name reducer into its own folder, or into its own file. Then in the index.js for the reducers, I'm going to import one helper function called combine reducers from Redux, and I'm going to import that name reducer from the name reducer file that we just created. And basically, what this function now is going to do is just going to export the default. Is going to combine the reducers. So combine reducers is a function that basically takes all of the reducers that you want to call and then create one single reducer from all of those that can be returned. So now this should go back to the root reducer, coming back from there, and that should now work. Okay. Attempted import error. Name reducer / name reducer. Why is John tweaking on me?
It's saying reducer is not there, not where you're exporting it from. So that path source Redux reducers is where it's actually from.
Right. But this is pulling this name reducer from the / name reducer inside of this file, inside of this folder. So they're in the same folder. So this / should still work here. This is talking about it from the index.js attempted.
I don't know if this does anything, but do you need a default? You know how you did export default for everything, but I don't think in name reducers it has a default.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, we could try this, but I don't. So basically, the basically the default statement for exports is just supposed. Basically, this has to be exported as a function, which is why I had it like exporting as a variable here. Name reducer, this reducer here, combine reducers, name reducer. Um, I don't want to waste time trying to debug this real quick. So let me just see if I do it like this. If I can. Damn, y'all really seeing me? Y'all really seeing me peek past my time here? Can y'all still hear me? My fault. Just trying to start tweaking it.
Yeah.
Yeah, my fault. Yeah, 10 o'clock, my Jawns shut down. Okay, cool. So let me just see if I could just actually do it like this, so I can not waste y'all's time real quick. Name reducer is not defined. Export default name reducer. Okay, cool. I'll figure that out on my own. But essentially, we have our reducer defined here. We're exporting it here so that it can be passed into our regular reducer here, and everything should work as we kind of expect. Now, all I want to do is test that this name change function is working. So I wanted to put a couple console logs in here just to show that the inside the name change function, just so that we can see that the state is going to get updated and we're going to trigger some changes here. This.props.dispatch is not a function. Damn, well, everything want to blow up on me right at the end. So inside of the person function here, name change, essentially, basically what I wanted to do was call this action, right? So inside of the person component, what I want to do here is trigger that name change based on the actions that that we defined here. So here, this is passing the right action. And what I need to do is ensure that this is connected correctly to the global state. Let's just do it the right way. So I'm past the connect helper here, and in a second I'm gonna use this, but I'm not planning on using it first right away. So let's just see if this will work. Yeah, I gotta do it like this. Okay, so now when this function is getting changed, the change name function. Okay, yeah. So I think this is working, but I gotta see with regard. Check the inspector and just see what's going on in here. Ooh, as a component. Oh, so it is working. So yeah, as you can see, this function inside the name change function is getting called. We're not seeing any change here, but that's because we updated this function, so it's not coming from local state anymore. But clearly, every time I was clicking in the change name, it was calling this function here from inside the name change function. So clearly our name change action is getting called correctly. Now, the last step is based on that name change function being called, our hope is that now our reducer, which is changing the global state, is also being called and changing some stuff on the global state. So the last step that you got to do for Redux, and this is literally the last, John, is you got to connect. Once you've connected your Redux to your, once you've connected your component to Redux, right? So we need to connect the component so we can make use of the dispatch function and all of that. But also the connect help function takes in two optional functions that you can define for yourself. One of them is called map state to props. And map state to props is a function, right, that you can define that is basically responsible for telling you, based off of the global state, what are the props that you want to take from the global state to pass into this particular component. So one of the basic states that I want to take is the name. I want to take that name parameter back from the state, which is basically in this reducers function, right? Where I took the name reducer and I combined the reducers into name. Basically, combine reducers means that if I have multiple other reducers, I could add those other reducers into this same state with different parameter names. So I gave this name reducer a state of name. So now inside of the person JS, right, I'm saying, hey, take that name state off of the global state, right? And just return that particular, return this as props. So now this means that I can use this .props.name, and it's going to refer to the same state. It'll refer to the data from the global state. So to show you that this is going to work now, right? Instead of having this .state.name, I'm going to change this to this .props.name. So Redux works by taking all of the data putting it into this global state, and then passing that information from the global state to your components as props. So now, as you can see, our app is working back as normal, but all of this is now changing from the global state parameter, right? And so we're getting this data now from the global state, which means, and this is the last thing I wanted to show you, that now that we're having all of this data coming from the global state, we can actually grab that data very easily from all of these other components just by adding the connect helper and grabbing the data from the global state that we really want to see. So inside of the feelings component, right, I also want some of the data from the global state. So I'm gonna just import the connect helper at the top and grab Redux package, grab the Redux library. And at the bottom, just like I did before, I want to connect this component to React Redux. So it kind of looks like this. Because this component isn't dispatching any actions, all I want to do is grab data from the Redux store. I'm going to define that map state to props function in here as well. I'm going to say map state to props. It takes in the global state as an argument and allows me to return whatever piece of the global state I want. So I'm going to return the name object from the global state. So this is the same thing. This line here is the same as saying something like this, right? These two lines are the same. And then return that particular prop. So now this function does exactly what it says it does. It maps the global state to props. So it takes this information from the global state, and now I can use this data as props in here as well. So I'm gonna set, instead of saying how are you feeling right now, I'm gonna say this.props.name is feeling, and let this change the this component here. Right. So as you can see, it already changed based on what was inside of here. So cam, and you see how all these components are now changing, updating in real time based on their connectivity to the global state. I could pass that same variable down to the hair color component just as simply, right? Just last time, let's just get it in our heads. Import the connect helper from React Redux. Scroll to the bottom to connect this component. And inside of here, because I want to grab data, I'm going to get the map state to props function, create a new map state to props function that will define what I want the global state to return for me. Grab the name property from the global state. Oh, oops. And return the name, right? So now inside of here, I can also use that prop, right? This dot props dot name. Right. And so now all three of these components are synced up and changing in real time based on their connectivity to the global state, right? They each have their local state, which can still change. And the local state doesn't affect the global state, but this component, right, the person component, where we're actually triggering some actions, right, by using this dispatch function here, is how we actually start making changes to the global state that then takes into account all of these changes and coming up with the changing the reducers that are changing the actions and everything in that sense. So the last thing I want to just show you right before we slide is nothing more crazy than anything that we just saw, but just to get rid of this funky syntax of this.props.dispatch and everything. That's why you can use this other function called map dispatch to props, which essentially map dispatch to props is another kind of function that you can define. And that function's responsibility is to return whatever functions you want to be able to dispatch from your particular component. So a map dispatch to props function would look like this. You have this dispatch prop that you can use. You get reference to, and then you just name the particular functions that you want to have as props, right? So here, clearly the function that I want is the same. It's the action function. It's the action handler. So it's called name change. So here I'm going to say name change. And I'm going to set it to be a function that dispatches name change. Oh, and you have to actually return, my fault, you have to return an object. So there you go. So now with this map dispatch to props function like this, now all I have to do in order to call this name change function is just this.props dot name change, just like this. So you get rid of that kind of weird funky syntax that was there before. But yeah, everything else should work. Oops, nope, called the wrong Jawns. Called the wrong, oh no, I think, is it just name change? It should just be this. Oh, wait. Did I name this right? Name change, name change. I should have just stopped while I'm ahead, right, y'all? I should just be like, dang, like this is it, you did it. Then I was like, taking one more step. Map dispatch to props, dispatch the name change. Am I missing something here? Well, don't worry about it, y'all. I'm gonna fix that and just kind of give y'all updated code so y'all can see the kind of whole thing yourself. But basically, this is the whole idea of Redux: is you can create this global state that is called a store. the global state is responsible for holding all the changes to our local code. And we use reducers to make sure that those changes are being handled appropriately. Once those changes are being reduced by way of these little helper functions, these conditional based statements, then the global store actually updates based on this state. This makes your code a little bit easier to then reuse and then send that information from component to component, kind of like we saw earlier, versus having to do all of these weird kind of syntactic things to have state in one component that then passes it to multiple other components. Redux kind of makes it so you have a global state, which is setting everything there, and then you can subscribe to the changes you actually want to see. But yeah, thank y'all for sticking with me a little bit. I know I went a while over and still got a little errors, but I appreciate y'all for rocking with me in general. And yeah, I'm going to fix this, give y'all some updated code and send it to y'all so that y'all can take a look at it. But this in a nutshell is kind of how the Redux library works. And yeah, grateful for y'all for sticking with me and taking a look at all of this stuff. Appreciate you.